COVID-19 has been a catalyst for ideas, for innovation.
Our employers have to be flexible.
How do we build wealth at the individual level, communities that did not have that previously?
Every city in the world will need to get more sustainable.
Innovators, entrepreneurs aren't just born, they're cultivated.
Building fair and inclusive economies is a complicated process, and we will need to be vigilant as we move forward.
Good morning. My name is Elisa Laurel, Program Manager for the Western Riverside Council of Governments, otherwise known as WRCOG, and we are honored and excited you could join us for our 4th episode of the Future Forward series. Now, for those of you that are new to our channel, make sure that you subscribe down below, and also a couple things that I'd like to point out. We here at WRCOG serve as a regional agency that focuses on helping many of our cities and jurisdictions in the Western Riverside County subregion. We have innovative programs such as transportation, planning, energy, environment, and conservation, just to name a few, that help out our members within the Western Riverside County subregion. Now, before we jump into today's presentation, as usual, I want to make sure that we thank our in-kind sponsors that have helped support this series overall. Big shout out and thank you to the Inland Empire Regional Chamber of Commerce and the Southern California Association of Governments. Now, many of you know the drill, but just in case, you can submit your questions by simply scanning the QR code that's going to appear in the corner of the screen. As you can, right here, I'm trying to point to the corner where I think it's going to appear. And you're going to use your cell to scan the QR code, and the QR code will populate a code that is forward and the number 4, FORWARD. 4 is the code that you're going to go ahead and plug in, and you can participate via the Slido app, or you can go ahead and go to your URL, which is slido.com, spelled SLIDO.com, and then type in the code forward, FORWARD, and the number 4. Now, for those of you who are familiar with our channel, this is a YouTube link, so you have the luxury of pausing and going back if you feel like you've missed any content. Now, today's broadcast focuses on how COVID-19 is changing the way we drive. Among the many new norms experienced living in this COVID-19 world, transportation is one that has notably been impacted. We're joined here today by Jerry Walters, Principal at Fehr Peers, and we're so excited that he could share some of his presentation with us today. Also, a little bit of a different dynamic, Chris Gray, our Director of Transportation and Planning, will be asking him a few questions throughout the presentation. So Chris, turning it over to you.
Lisa, thank you. Let's go ahead and get started on our presentation. As I'm sure you're all aware, COVID-19 has profoundly affected all aspects of our lives, including our travel behavior. Anyone who has driven on our roads can observe fewer vehicles, as many people either choose to stay at home or are forced to stay at home for a variety of reasons. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the short-term and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on travel throughout our transportation system. Jerry, first question. What are the immediate short-term and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on travel, including both personal vehicles and public transit?
Thank you, Chris. The simplest statement I can make on that subject is that the economy and willingness to share among travelers will be the primary drivers of transportation demand and also revenues from transportation. The economic uncertainties are pretty clear to all of us. They're present in our everyday lives, and our emergence from the situation that we're in is going to depend on the timing of medical milestones, the potential for a second wave, which we may actually have entered at this point, extending the time frame from now to when we get back to normal. And the longer the recession lasts, the more difficult the recovery is going to be. So these are some of the forces that are prevailing on transportation as we see it now. What the recovery might look like, the preliminary evidence, is that the national experience has been a dramatic loss in jobs. to about 15% or more unemployment in April and early May. Some of that recovered. There was about a 15% recovery in May, although a lot of people that were being counted as employed were in fact not back at work. They were just furloughed or for some other reason being asked to stay home. So unemployment's been a dramatic impact on travel. And for the Inland Empire, the situation is going to be potentially even more concerning in some respects, because those segments of the real estate economy or the employment economy that have been hardest hit include leisure and hospitality, which in fact is the fourth biggest labor sector in Riverside County. So the national loss in that sector has been 42%, but in Riverside County, it's been 67% jobs lost in your fourth biggest sector. Consumer confidence is also dramatically down, and retail sales are down below where they were in the 2008 recession. And the return of retail activity is going to be something we want to watch carefully, because even in China, which we're a number of months ahead in terms of coming out of the close down on the economy, the recovery was relatively slow. There was a burst of activity as soon as the stay at home and other orders were released, but the actual sustained increase in retail sales has been less than 40% of normal. So that takes us to trying to think ahead toward where the forecasts might take us on things, the potential for things to happen differently. The preliminary forecasts on this slide are from one of the top 4 economic accounting firms in the world. And they're supposing and projecting that the recovery is going to take at least to 2023, and depending on the scenario they look at, beyond 2023, in terms of some of the key indicators of how the economy is doing. And what business leaders are beginning to tell us are that they're rethinking their business models. They're thinking in terms of moving away from some of the dense central areas that they've been most recently occupying and moving into some different configurations with satellite offices in suburban locations, and what they're referring to as hub and spoke, where there's still a headquarters downtown, but it's smaller, and they have small offices around the region, including places like Riverside County. So that's a little bit of a flavor of where we think we're going in the bigger picture. But when you get right down to it, to think about what's really happening, this slide begins to show you how things have prospered so far in Southern California, in the greater region. And what we can see here is, because of the different mixes of demographics and employment in the different counties, for the first 3 months up through June, the inland counties, Riverside and San Bernardino, dropped less in terms of traffic activity. VMT is a measure of vehicle miles of travel. So that's the number of people and the number of miles they're traveling on a daily basis. Those went down less far in Riverside and San Bernardino than in Orange and LA counties. And in terms of recovering, the inland counties have recovered to a much greater degree. They're only half as deep into the decline as the coastal counties. And one of the underlying factors, in fact, several of them, are what people have been doing to cope during the recession so far. So there are a number of us, and I'll talk more about this later, that are working from home. And in fact, the intentions of folks working from home are suggesting that around 3 times as many people will be wanting to work from home in the future than have worked from home in the past. So that could lead to a considerable reduction on commuting activity. With regard to shopping as well, dramatic increase in the online shopping over the last few months, and about 80% are predicting that they're going to increase online shopping and that they're going to continue to do that as the economy recovers. And the willingness to entertain travel by modes other than private automobile has also been compromised pretty dramatically. About 60% of folks surveyed think that Uber and Lyft are now unacceptably unsafe in the shared use of the vehicles. And transit as well. People are concerned about returning to transit. So that's some of the foundation on which we're needing to build transportation back to some semblance of normal. Here on this slide are some statistics on how many people are thinking they're going to remain online for grocery shopping, for meal delivery, for working from home. Considerable reductions in the number saying that they intend to go back to work 5 days a week. And even businesses are saying that they're not going to expect their employees to come back at that level, even when they get back to normal. And part of that, from their point of view, the employer's point of view, is trying to keep their employment locations less densely occupied. Fewer employees there on any given day gives them the opportunity to provide for more social distancing. On the other hand, though, there has been a wave of working from home for more than 20 years. And on the contrary to what we're thinking people in businesses are saying at the moment, we've seen that since 2000, some substantial companies like B of A and IBM and AT&T have rescinded their work from home opportunities and have brought all of their employees back to work. So there's a real question about what people are thinking and what actually might end up being the case. So when we look at this, we see that there are, on this slide, a number of elements to what's likely to contribute to increases in vehicle miles traveled that are pointing upward to an increase, and a number that are pointing downwards to a decrease. Residential and jobs growth will be expected, and potentially more in suburban locations than in urban locations as we get out of the present situation. And for the Inland Empire, logistics growth is an area of definite growth. And we've seen that even through the recession that we're in now, and we expect to see more of it. And mode shift away from transit and pooling services is also shifting into personal vehicle travel and increasing mileage. But on the other hand, factors like unemployment, retail, which is truly suffering and will continue to suffer, more working from home, fuel prices, which were low pre-pandemic, may get back, and in fact are working their way back up, and incomes may remain low. So downward pointing arrows, in addition to upward pointing arrows on vehicle travel. And then there are the effects that are even unpredictable in terms of the ability of local government and the will and ability of state and federal governments to begin to blunt some of these effects. For local governments, sustaining revenue is going to be a critical issue. In Riverside County, for example, land use decisions, how to accommodate a potential surge in growth will be important. What to do about the transportation network, given shifts in modal preferences, and keeping tabs on what people's behavior is showing signs of becoming, and being able to plan ahead for that will be critical to the kind of actions local governments can make and take. And then from the federal and state levels, the pace at which the economy is permitted to reopen, financial support, and also stimulus dollars. There continue to be discussions of more stimulus money, questions on where that money is targeted, to how much is to infrastructure and transportation. So with all those upward and downward pointing arrows, this slide shows an example of some forecasts that we can do on what might happen depending on the combination of directions of those effects. And we can see that in some cases, we might see a dramatic increase within a year or two in vehicle miles traveled. And that is with suburban migration going up dramatically, with people returning to work, returning to their workplaces, fuel prices remaining low, everybody back to school, et cetera. But on a number of scenarios, we see less than full recovery. And some of them, especially with continuing work from home, for example, never getting back up to where vehicle travel once was. So what's going to be key to watch is how some of these underlying forces are changing and what local and higher level governments can do about that. So that's the overall sense of things that I have in response to your first question.
Great. Jerry, thank you. Many of those who are participating in our event today are familiar with our use of online polling. So we'd like to hear from you specifically about the topic of how often you believe people will continue to work from home. So we're going to go ahead and open a poll to ask you your opinion, how often you think that the majority of people in the future will be working from home. Your options: will it be 1 day per week on average, 2 days per week on average, 3 days per week on average, or more than 3 days per week on average? And we'll report the results of this and the potential impacts of this on vehicle miles traveled and other transportation metrics at the end of our presentation. So Jerry, the next topic we'd like to talk about is travel activity related to delivery travel. Whether it's ordering dinner from Grubhub, groceries from Instacart, or the Amazon packages that we all seem to need, delivery travel seems to be up significantly. What can you tell us about how COVID-19 is affecting freight and delivery travel?
Yeah, you're right in identifying that as an important factor for Riverside County, because trucks are a substantial part of your current activity. Deliveries of all forms, long distance, freeway-based, big rig travel, and local deliveries, and travels from the ports and travels off to the rest of the country. So what we see from the statistics is that about 15% of the travel and traffic on some of your major facilities is truck traffic. And as you know, and as we see, there are likely to be dramatic increases in that, relatively unaffected by the economic downturn. So you already have planned and underway substantial increases in logistics and distribution centers. And your county forecast done 5 years ago and looking towards what they thought and you thought things were going to be like today, we're projecting a 40% increase in truck volumes between 2015 and 2020. And that's only going to continue to increase given circumstances that the pandemic is bringing about. On this slide, I was able to gather just a handful of statements made, of quotes from major real estate and economic business leaders. And you can see that in all of them, where they're commenting on national trends, they just happen to be citing the Inland Empire as a significant recipient of growth in warehouse and other logistics businesses. So that's one wave that the county can expect will continue to come its way, even as the economy falters in other respects. What we see at the more local level, the home delivery and the deliveries to local businesses, is that is also shifting fairly dramatically. Before the recession, when one looked at it in 2017, one could see that the number of home deliveries per person had doubled in the preceding 8 years. And the projection at that point in time, of course, independent of knowledge of the pandemic, was that it was going to double again in another 6 years. Now we're seeing a shift of those deliveries and shifting away from businesses where restaurants and offices are closed or less active, but shifting to home locations. So Amazon deliveries are up 50%, UPS and USPS are up 15 to 25%. The history of measurement of truck activity, there was a bit of a dip nationally in April when things were just not back on the road, 13%. But in California, it was much less than that. It was only 4%. And all of that has returned to about normal. So one substantial aspect of travel in Riverside County and Inland Empire is going to be growth in logistics. And to kind of put that in a nutshell, given the losses in revenue that are likely to be coming from other sources like sales tax and business taxes and from gasoline tax, consumption of gasoline, the region is likely to be hard pressed to maintain reasonable levels of mobility for goods movement, given that that sector is going to be growing in that same time period. Right. So that's, I think, my perspective on how logistics and good movements are going to fare.
Right. Thank you, Jerry. So on to our next topic. There is some anecdotal evidence that COVID-19 might change the demand for certain types of land uses. Could travel behavior changes due to COVID-19 drive changes in land development patterns in Western Riverside County?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. The degree is somewhat uncertain at this point in time, but what we're seeing in the intentions that are being voiced by businesses are that 3/4 of them are suggesting they're going to relocate at least a small percentage of their employment to more remote locations from the center cities. And that 1/4 of them are saying that they're going to actually relocate a fairly substantial number. So businesses are very, very likely to be looking your way here in Riverside County. The words of description as to what these businesses are thinking about isn't always that they're planning on moving wholesale to the suburbs, but they're certainly talking about satellite offices and what they describe as hub and spoke models, where there continues to be a downtown headquarters, but it's smaller, and that there are work centers in other parts of the region that are more convenient to where their employees live. So we see non-residential development coming your way. And residential, I think that what we're all reading in the newspapers are telling us that people are more concerned with living in central areas and with what it costs to live there, and how the desire to social distance and the reductions in many people's ability to have the same levels of income that they once had are having them look more to moving out of the high-cost central locations. This slide is one that shows emerging trends as we understood them before the pandemic began. We conducted a survey in 2019 of about 30 experts in land use economics and real estate. And this was based on the expectations that new technologies like autonomous vehicles and Uber and Lyft and the ability to work from home were going to potentially cause people to relocate. And at that time, even last year, these experts were suggesting about a 10% increase in regional development shifting to suburban locations. And at the same time, they were predicting a continuation of the trend where retail space was going to continue to decline. And that effect has been made even more profound by the recession that we're presently experiencing. So retail space per capita is going to get smaller and less likely to be able to afford central locations. So you can, on the one aspect of that is more growth in the region. Another aspect is less sales tax revenue and less revenue from development fees from real estate. So again, a bind in terms of demand going in one direction and revenue going in the other direction. So that's a general sense of what you can expect in terms of growth and migration to the county.
So as we just discussed, COVID-19 could potentially change the way in which our region develops, both in terms of residential and non-residential uses. So we'd like to hear from you, your opinion. So we're now going to open up our second poll. And the question is whether you think COVID-19 will change preferences for people to live and work in suburban settings like Western Riverside County. You'll have four options. 1, more people want to live in these suburban settings but not work in them. Number 2, more people want to work in these types of suburban environments but not live in them. Option 3 is people want to both live and work in these type of suburban areas. And option 4 is it will have no effect on locational choices. We were interested in hearing from you, and as with our first poll, we'll be sharing with you the results of this second poll after we include the presentation. Jerry, prior to the arrival of COVID-19, there was a significant amount of investment in new modes of travel, such as autonomous vehicles and ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft. How has COVID-19 impacted these emerging travel modes?
Yeah, a very good question. And even before COVID-19, predictions about where those modes of travel were going to affect people's behavior and the operation of our road network were still being debated. This slide gives two different impressions of how close we actually are to having autonomous vehicles able to really provide the kind of services that have been promised, at least in the future, the distant future. That is autonomous vehicles that do not need any activity by a driver. The driver can be asleep or without a driver, vehicles driving around empty. And here are two different perspectives on that. Tesla is approaching that level by means that they think is most effective for them, which is to put technology on the road. And even though there have been some lives lost in that process, they are learning from how vehicles behave and how people within those vehicles behave. And they're gradually moving toward implementing higher and higher levels of independence of their vehicles. But it's still, it's still limited to lane holding and speed control and those types of things. So not anywhere what you need to be to have drivers no longer involved whatsoever. Waymo, which is the Google brother under the Alphabet mantle, which has been doing this longer than anybody, has this, I think, very interesting quote. They are stating that they're not reaching the timeframes that they had originally projected. And in fact, they're 90% of the way there, but they still have 90% of the way to go because they've addressed all the big requirements, but there are just countless small issues and needs given the broad variety of circumstances that are confronted by us and our vehicles on an everyday basis. Getting out to every possible event that one might confront is something that's going to take them considerably longer. And then when we get to what the capabilities of autonomous vehicles are going to be, even when they are out in full form on the roads, some of those promises I believe are overstated as well. I mean, the initial statements were that 90% of collisions and injuries were going to be prevented because 90% of accidents are generally attributed to driver error, and that AVs are going to dramatically improve the capacity of our roads. Whereas if you look at it a bit more deeply, and the insurance industry has, when they look at the types of collisions that occur and how many of those could actually be avoided by autonomous vehicle technology, their reduction is more likely to be important, obviously, and dramatic, but on the order of 30–35%. And when we do simulations of how they will operate on the roads, we see there will be improvements in operating on freeways where the number of conflict points and intersections are really not a factor. And vehicles are moving generally at the same speeds. But it's an improvement to where a congested freeway might move from 25 miles per hour to about 35 miles per hour, even with full fleets of autonomous vehicles. And in the short term, while autonomous vehicles are still becoming as bold as they think that they might become, while they're operating very conservatively as they are now, they're actually going to be worsened delays on particularly local streets when autonomous vehicles are in the mix. So those are some of the prospects for the promises that autonomous vehicles suggested. They're not insignificant. There are significant types of promise, but the magnitudes, I think, may be overstated. And this slide shows some of the downside potential. We've been able to actually look around the country and used a dozen different regional travel models from places all over the country to model the likely effects of autonomous opportunity on the amount of travel people conduct. And what we find consistently is a notable increase in vehicle miles traveled because of the freedoms that autonomous vehicles would offer. On the order of, let's say, about 30%, if no additional sharing of those vehicles was going to occur. At that time, before the current situation, there was a belief that autonomous vehicles could at least serve multiple users by dropping somebody off and then traveling to somebody else and giving them a ride. But now, with reluctance to share, we think that's even less likely to be the case. So even the idea that increase in VMT could be dampened to maybe about 15 or 20% is not likely. So we are thinking in terms of, let's say, a 30% increase in vehicle travel being one of the consequences of more autonomous vehicles. So the next slide here gets to the topic of what we refer to as transportation network companies, TNCs, which we know better as Uber and Lyft. Some of the general understanding or belief is that TNCs represent a high percentage of travel going on our streets. And this is studying that we've been able to conduct in a half dozen or so major metropolitan areas around the US. And what we see when we look at the proportion of vehicle miles that are conducted by Uber and Lyft compared to the grand total vehicle miles, that except for places like the very center of San Francisco, where it's about 13%, or Washington, DC, or Boston, where it's up around 7 or 8%. When we get to other cities like the LA region, the total, even the center of the region, is about 3%. And in the suburban communities, it's only about 2% of travel. So they haven't represented a big factor so far in terms of increased vehicle miles of travel. And we see that at least initially, there's going to be reluctance to return to those modes. So, in the early stages of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders, we saw that Lyft, in fact, had declined by 70% in the amount of use. And people are saying that they're reluctant to return, that in the periods beyond people are at least 10 to 15% less likely to use TNCs, Uber and Lyft, than they were pre-pandemic because of safety concerns. So we see the effects of that aspect of what we think of as emerging transportation being dampened in the future and not being a big factor in affecting the change in Riverside County in the future. So this slide is a summary of essentially things that I just stated in terms of the losses in the past and the intentions of people in the future to use these transportation network companies. They face challenges with regard to giving people higher confidence levels, but unlike transit, they're at least able to enforce that people wear masks on board. So they have a bit of an advantage over transit in terms of people's confidence level in going back to Uber and Lyft. But on the other hand, the effects on TNCs will also be likely highly related to the kinds of travel that they've served in the past. And what we see them having served most in the past has been the kinds of travel that have been most impacted by and where there are most likely to be sustained impacts of the pandemic concerns and the economic downturn. Things like social and entertainment travel to events and gatherings in restaurants and bars, for example, and traveling to the airport. So some of the types of travel that these companies have been serving in the past are not going to return as quickly as they might return for transit, which was mainly reliant on commuting travel. So that's at least two of the main elements of emerging transportation and what we see becoming of them as we now travel beyond the current recession.
Great. Jerry, thank you. We now go to our next topic, and our final topic, which will be talking about public agency finances. How will changes in travel behavior impact the need for new transportation facilities and the funding outlook?
Yeah, the simplest statement I could make is that it's complicated, because as I showed earlier, there are a number of factors that could be pointing in upward or downward or sideways directions. So to make it as simple as possible, just to take a few of the primary suspects in what will change, this slide shows how crowding concerns and work from home might play a role. And as I said a moment ago, crowding concerns will affect modes like transit and possibly carpooling and even ride-hailing companies. But the proportions of travel currently or historically occurring on those modes were small. And the percentage of people that were using them that could change, will not be everybody. Some percentage of them will remain. So at the bottom line, we could see perhaps a 2% increase in vehicle miles for people changing modes and going to private automobiles. On the other hand, if we look at work from home, pre-pandemic, it was about 5% people doing so. If you look at the various surveys, it kind of boils down to opinions by both business and individuals that people will work from home work at the office about 20% less. That they'll either stay home one day a week, or that 20% of them will stay at home all the time, but 80% will come back to work. It's something in that magnitude. But when we think of the Inland Empire, we think of the percentage of jobs here that can actually take advantage of work from home, it's only about half. So the net effect of that set of conditions is going to be potentially about a 10% growth in working from home, meaning a VMT decrease of about that same proportion. So sum total on this slide is maybe a 10% decrease, but more than offsetting a 2% increase brought about by lack of sharing modes. But it is complicated, as I said. So this slide is an example of a very hypothetical, illustrative example of how we, in at least one scenario, imagine things might transpire in Western Riverside County. So you can see on the right all the upward and downward pointing arrows of how things might change, including a reduction in transit service and an increase in land use migration, but also continued work from home. And here we see this extrapolates it out even to 2030, when we might be thinking the new normal will have arrived. And what we can see is that VMT vehicle travel will be getting back up on a per capita basis to what was pre-pandemic. So with the growth in the county, we'll be back above. But the transit will struggle, at least under this set of assumptions. This next slide shows a few variations on the theme. So what happens if everybody goes back to work? So in that case, we can see even independent of some of the other factors pointing upward, that factor alone would bring VMT per capita back above its original level. So migration will bring it obviously considerably further on top of the growth that you had already anticipated before you started to think about additional migration. On the right, we show the differences between a resurgence of the pandemic infections, which we may be venturing into at the moment, creating what's referred to as more of a U-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery, where people are going back to work in reasonable numbers and high numbers by 2021. So there again, you see vehicle miles of travel having very different trajectories. So this next slide begins to try to translate both at least the short term into consequences on the revenue side, fiscal impacts. A national report to Congress by the American Association of Highway Transportation Officials has estimated about a 30% reduction in state transportation revenues through at least the next couple of years. And at the same time, depending how development occurs, and certainly a suppression in real estate and retail investment, you can expect some reductions in your impact fees. You can expect reductions in your sales tax revenue until vehicle miles climbs back up, reductions in gas tax revenues, and express lane revenues, and continued suppression of fare box recovery from transit. And then there are the questions about the state and federal sources, what they will be, whether there'll be increases in gas tax, and whether changes in vehicle technology towards electric vehicles will diminish that. And then what new registration fees are going to conduct? Will people be buying more cars? So a number of factors on the revenue side, which are still too soon to predict. So a general statement on the consequences on this slide are that in the short term, you're going to need, I believe, this is my sense of things, to expect less revenue from all sources. But in the longer term, you're going to need to be preparing for growth in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and need for infrastructure to support that might be greater than you had anticipated. So what do we think we should be doing about that? One is to be tracking the trends and to begin to see what's going on, to measure both sentiment and real action on the part of business and personal attitudes towards travel and relocation and shopping, going back to work, and looking at the degree to which those are going to affect travel. We don't expect in the midterm to see, as I said earlier, AVs becoming a significant factor, but ride sharing will begin to recover. Logistics will recover in terms of domestic. Overseas logistics, maybe not so quickly if more onshoring begins to occur as a result of all the discussions we're hearing on trade and the need to have in this country more reliable supply chains, less reliant on countries that we have want to have less reliance on. So that will be moving, and we believe that will be a net upward, and certainly in the new normal in the longer term. More migration, continued sharing concerns, but they'll diminish over time, especially with vaccine and continual testing. Commute reductions, probably more working from home. The AV use will increase by maybe about that time period. But that will be something that will effectively increase vehicle miles of travel. The effects on vehicle travel will be more in the more congestion direction than in the less congestion direction. And that might be offset to a degree by capacity benefits, but not fully. And then we see that we do expect increase in ride hailing and a considerable increase in logistics, especially domestic logistics. So summing up, lost revenue from potentially development related in the short term, consumption in VMT, post-recession, more VMT, being hard pressed to maintain a pace that matches the pace of growth in logistics travel, and emerging technologies not really helping you too much, being more likely to increase vehicle miles than reduce it. So keeping a finger on the pulse means watching a long list of indicators, as this slide summarizes. And they'll begin to give you an impression of not only what's going on, but what you can anticipate as you look at their directions and the statements of those who influence these sources. And then taking it to maybe summing up, anticipating is obviously important. We can't be sure from the information we have at the moment how things are going to transpire. So we need to continue with local surveys, not only of travel, but on the state of the economy. And we need to do modeling to get a projection of where that's heading and what it means to us. And in addition to anticipating, we need to begin acting on those trends and on making up the losses of revenue, planning strategically and diligently with the kinds of effects that we think will occur on travel, more vehicle miles occurring over the longer term, resurging from where they are currently still well below typical levels to potentially above typical expected levels. So that's my sum total on where I think things are headed.
Great. Thanks, Jerry, for sharing all that great information with us. Turning it back to you, Elisa.
So thank you, Jerry and Chris. We will now be turning it over to the Q&A portion of our broadcast. I just wanted to remind everyone, please be sure to scan the QR code that's appearing in the corner of the screen. And the event code for this episode is forward, FORWARD, and the number 4. Again, FORWARD, and the number 4. You can go ahead and submit your questions in that regard. And as we get the questions teed up, I wanted to introduce our Director of Transportation and Planning for WRCOG, Chris Gray. He'll be taking the questions live, so don't forget to submit them. And we look forward to some of the questions that you have. So Chris and Jerry, take it away.
Thank you, Elisa. Jerry, we're going to go ahead and kick off our Q&A by reviewing the results of our polling that was done. And as you all recall, we had 2 polls that were done. The first poll was asking you about how often you think people will be working from home. The most popular answer was actually 2 days per week. So Jerry, do you want to kick off our Q&A by talking about how that might affect, that level of working from home might affect vehicle miles traveled?
Yeah, sure. We happen to have just recently developed a tool through which we can project various scenarios related to the current economic situation in the pandemic. And I can show it on screen here now. It gives us the opportunity to look at 16 different variables, including work from home. It's got matters such as total employment, people going back to school, whether people are going to be interested in going back to social events and the time frame for doing that. A number of other factors. Will deliveries go up or down? Transit service, how will that fare during the recession? Things like land use change, like migration patterns, auto ownership, and investments, et cetera. So here's a bit of a glimpse of it. What you're seeing now on the right side is some of the options, and you're seeing a forecast that we just prepared under somewhat reasonable circumstances, which project that by the time we get out 5 or more years from now, under this set of assumptions, VMT per capita may go back up higher than, and in this case, 9% higher than what it was before the recession. But transit is going to have trouble recovering as quickly. But that's all depending on the assumptions we make. So if I scroll down to, let's see, telecommuting and work from home, the selection was, I've got it set now that everybody goes back to work next year and stays there at 100%. But if the belief is that it's going to stay down, in fact, it's already down about here. And if we think about within 5 years, if that's the 2 days staying home, that would suggest that maybe, therefore, 80% are going back to work. And if we leave it leveling off at that, the new normal is that VMT per capita, in fact, doesn't get back. It gets barely back to what it was ahead of the recession that we're in. But that statement about 2 days a week or 1 day a week from home relates to only those people that can do it. So if that's what the response is projecting, that means that given about half of your job sectors in the county don't have that luxury of working from home, everybody's trip making is going to still be more suppressed. So that brings the curve down a little bit. So under these circumstances, you can get back essentially to traffic as it is today on a per capita basis. And what will govern it is the growth that occurs in the region that will drive it up even further if growth occurs.
Jerry, can you maybe add a little bit about why businesses value people working in the office? It happens. I'm just not sure people explicitly understand some of the benefits and maybe some of the conversations you and others have had with business owners about why they would want to bring people back to the office.
I can, although many of them are changing their story as we speak. I've spent a bit of time at Google and at Facebook, and as we've heard, the leaders of those companies say, and folks at Apple and others before them, being on scene with everybody there just leads to a whole level of additional momentum behind everybody's thought process. What they call serendipitous encounters in the hallway or at the water cooler or in the cafeteria bring up discussions that just occur spontaneously and have really been important to their ability to stay ahead of the game And what they were saying up until, in Google's case last week, was when the CFO was asked, what do you anticipate to be the number of people staying and working from home, continuously? His answer was as few as possible. Then last week, Google announced that they're having everybody stay at home for another year. So as they think about the concerns of people coming back and be exposed, people's kids in school, that keep them from being able to comfortably get back to work if their kids are not getting back to school, it's beginning to look as though work from home is going to last for a while, even for those types of companies.
So, Jerry, our second poll was, we asked about people's preferences for whether COVID-19 would change people's preferences for living and working in suburban settings. I'm curious how that might affect travel, the travel outputs. And the survey, about 2/3 of our respondents believe that we would see more growth in suburban settings like Western Riverside County, both for households and employment. So how might that affect future travel?
Right. Yeah, I think it's better to believe that work and homes will begin coming into the county, because what we've seen historically and what the projections otherwise were for Riverside County is that it's been job deficient, job poor. None of those words make ideal sense, but up until essentially the present, the average jobs per household within SCAG region is around 1.3, and yours has been less than 0.9. So considerable shortage of jobs that I think everybody's aware of. The projections made before the pandemic were that jobs would grow more than twice as fast as housing in the county. And what that did was suppress the amount of traffic growth that was going to occur. Even though jobs were going to grow by about 80% over the next 30 years, traffic was only projected to go up about 35%. And that's because a lot of those jobs were just fulfilling the needs of those living in the county. And so what we would, it still ends up with the county being short. So if we have even more migration than that, we can make up some of the remaining difference in the county in terms of jobs, because even the pre-pandemic forecasts were that you're going to be short about 15 or 20% in jobs in the county for an ideal balance. What it means beyond that to the entire region to have more migration is something that this trend lab can also show. Here is the land use pattern set of options, and just starting from where we left off. If the thought is that we're going to gradually move into a lot more jobs and housing in suburban locations, this is an example of 10%, and this is an example of 20% moving into suburban locations. So because people living in Riverside County are more likely to drive instead of using transit, walk, and bike than other parts of the region, people moving to the county are going to generate more regional VMT than had they stayed in the center of the region.
So Jerry, another, I believe there may be inputs on trend labs related to distance learning and school participation. Could you talk about how that might be affecting VMT as well?
Sure. Remote learning here, I have it preset for gradual return to school, at least over the next 30 years. That by next year, there's still going to be considerable remote learning. And we know most of the universities that I've been hearing about are planning not to resume on-site. And many communities that I hear about are also planning not to bring school attendance back in September or August. So even this 50% remote is a bit maybe optimistic in terms of return. But if that's where it gets in 2021, and then it gradually climbs back to 80 and then potentially 100%. That's what we have now. But if, like work at home, people, they offer a lot more opportunities for people to kind of rotate in and out of school, like in order to work in the limited space. They may have some students come in some days and other students come in other days for on-site personal interaction with teachers, and then continue with work or school from home on other days. So given that school trips are not a big percentage of overall travel, when I bring these down, it doesn't bring the total down significantly, but it brings it down a bit.
So, Jerry, I'm going to have 2 more questions for you in the Q&A, and then I also wanted to let everyone know that we have some questions we're not going to be able to get to because of time. But if you did submit a question and we didn't get to it, we'll be providing you with some written responses. So we'll make sure every question gets answered. So Jerry, your second to last question is, do you see how might businesses leaving California affect overall VMT?
Yeah, the 2-part question then is how many will leave, and I'm not sure I'm an expert on that, although we hear a lot about businesses wanting to open remote locations. Often they're talking about hub and spoke, which means having some, let's say, suburban locations that are smaller than their headquarters that might be in downtown, and then opening, reducing the number of people coming into downtown, so people have the option of working closer to home and having everything fully wired. So within the state, there's more likely to be migration out from the center. Leaving the state, I would say that you can make a direct comparison between the percentage of people leaving the state and the percentage of traffic reduction, because they'll take their trips and their cars with them. And if you get a 10% out migration, you'll get a 10% traffic reduction.
So, Jerry, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you for a prediction. So, which of these changes do you think are going to stick, and which of them do you think are temporary? People are pretty resilient, and they have certain behaviors ingrained in them. So, thinking out 10 years, is it what do you see changing? What do you see being a lasting change, and what do you see maybe going back to current conditions?
Yeah, this is just personal opinion, but looking back at past events that were nowhere near what we're experiencing now, but looking back at the 2008 recession for a sense of what a big economic shift meant to people and their time recovering from that, and looking back to 9/11 as a case where people were afraid to go out, afraid to fly, et cetera, for a period of time. The recoveries occurred quicker than we might have thought. People have ways of, due to resilience. In fact, even when businesses opened in May and June, a lot of people got out there and were doing things. Now, so there's a pent-up demand for that, and that is likely to sustain. We know that even though the real estate bubble reduced people's overinvestment in real estate around 2008 and 9, and for a long period, that's been climbing back up, and it's shifted. Car loans were made a lot more readily available and a lot cheaper, and what some might say was overconsumption of new cars was occurring. So people have this tendency to want to make the most of their lives as it happens, rather than suffer what they experienced in the past for longer than they're comfortable or like to do that.
Well, with that, Jerry, I want to our time with you today has come to a close. I want to thank you for all your great insights. Thank everyone who participated in the event, the polling and the questions, and there were a handful of questions we weren't able to get to. We'll be providing responses to that when we send out summaries of this meeting. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Elisa.
Thank you, Chris and Jerry, and thank you to our viewers out there for tuning in to today's episode. If you're new to our channel and to our series overall, again, please make sure to subscribe down below. And we'll be providing a downloadable link of the presentation materials to everyone who registered for today's broadcast. Additionally, you should be able to find the PowerPoint and other informational materials in the description box of the YouTube link down below. Now, before we sign off, we look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast, which will be held on August 27th from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. It's going to be our 5th episode. And we'll be getting the registration out to all you folks soon, so stay tuned for that. Lastly, in honor of today's broadcast and theme on transportation, we are excited to share the completion of our 108th TUMF project in the city of Menifee. So thank you for joining us this morning. Don't forget to subscribe, stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy the following video.
WRCOG's Transportation Uniform Mitigation Fee Program, also known as TUMF, is a creative initiative to fund critical transportation infrastructure to accommodate traffic created by population growth and commercial development throughout western Riverside County. Recently, through various integral partnerships, the 108th TUMF project was completed, the Scott Road interchange in the city of Menifee. This project is a reconstruction of the existing interchange and included a bridge expansion, which will enhance a busy corridor in one of the fastest growing cities in California. In addition to a variety of other partners, the TUMF program contributed $15 million to the Scott Road interchange project. With its completion, it will not only elevate the quality of life for businesses and residents living in the city of Menifee, but also the countless commuters and visitors using main roadways every day.
Well, the city's early visionaries knew that we needed jobs in this community, and so we have land use plans and zoning set up for business parks, corporate business parks, for clean industry in the city. And so having this interchange in place really helps pave the way and make it so that those businesses can come.
From a residential standpoint, I mean, we're so thrilled to have this. I mean, it is bringing such relief in the traffic to the city. We have a lot of residents in the south end of the town, both on the east and the west side of the freeway, that currently sit in traffic day in and day out trying to get out of that intersection. You know, before these on-ramps and off-ramps were open, there would be traffic backed up out onto the freeway, and that was, now that it's open, it's a significant safety increase for us as well.
Prior to the interchange, it was hard to access this area. So now with the completion of the interchange, it's improving traffic circulation to make the properties that are located adjacent to the freeway more accessible, and what we hope is more interesting to commercial development. We were very fortunate in getting a very qualified contractor and an excellent construction management team that resulted in a 10-month construction of the interchange.
Well, we're very grateful for our partnerships with WRCOG, with RCTC, and it's the folks who passed Measure DD in 2016, the 1-cent sales tax, that really helped us be able to afford to do this project and deliver it on time.